Don't ignore this, a secret letter from your soulmate has arrived for you. Before you scroll, before your mind tries to label this as coincidence or imagination, pause for just a moment. There's a reason your attention landed here right now. Not later. Not yesterday. Now. And what you're about to read isn't meant to impress you or rush you. It's meant to reach you, quietly, personally, the way something written only for you would. This isn't loud. This isn't dramatic. This is intimate. Imagine, for a second, that someone has been holding words inside them for a very long time. Not because they didn't want to speak, but because they didn't know how. Words that didn't fit into conversations. Feelings that didn't belong in timing. Truths that felt too heavy to drop into the middle of ordinary life. Those words became a letter. Not one written on paper. One written in thought, in memory, in regret, in clarity that came too late. This is that letter. They never meant for you to feel confused. They never intended to leave you wondering whether what you felt was real. And if they could sit across from you right now, no distractions, no fear, no consequences, this is what they would want you to hear. They would start slowly, because rushing would feel wrong. They would say that meeting you didn't feel like meeting someone new. It felt like remembering something they had forgotten about themselves. Something softer. Something honest. Something real. And that recognition didn't come with fireworks or instant declarations. It came quietly, the way truth usually does, disguised as comfort. At first, they tried to ignore it. They told themselves it was nothing. That it was timing. That it was harmless. That life was already complicated enough. But the problem with real recognition is that it doesn't ask permission. It settles in. It changes how you hear your own thoughts. It rearranges your inner world without announcing itself. They began noticing how conversations with you lingered longer than they should. How your presence stayed even after you left. How your words echoed back to them during moments when they were alone and unguarded. And that scared them. Because they weren't looking for this. Because their life was already shaped. Because wanting you didn't feel reckless, it felt true. So they did what many people do when truth arrives before readiness. They stayed quiet. Not because they didn't care. But because caring felt dangerous. They didn't want to open a door they couldn't walk through properly. They didn't want to make promises they weren't free to keep. They didn't want to invite you into a story where you'd have to shrink, wait, or hide. So instead of speaking, they watched. They watched how you carried yourself. How you listened without interrupting. How you felt deeply without demanding. They noticed how you didn't force connection, you allowed it. And that made everything harder, because nothing about you felt manipulative or fleeting. You weren't trying to be unforgettable. You just were. If this were a letter, this is the part where their handwriting would pause. Because this is where the regret lives. They would tell you that there were moments when they almost said something. Moments when your eyes met theirs and the words sat right at the edge of their mouth. Moments when silence felt heavier than truth. But each time, reality stepped in, responsibility, timing, fear, the knowledge that once spoken, nothing would ever be the same. So they chose restraint. And restraint doesn't feel noble when you're the one holding it. It feels lonely. It feels like swallowing something you were meant to say out loud. It feels like carrying a truth that doesn't belong anywhere yet. They want you to know this part clearly: your value was never the question. You were never almost enough. You were never too much. You were never a distraction. You were clarity arriving at the wrong moment. That's a painful place to be on both sides. They noticed how you sensed things without being told. How you felt shifts before they happened. How you didn't push when something felt off, you knew. That kind of emotional intelligence doesn't go unnoticed. It doesn't go unremembered either. In quiet moments, they would imagine a version of life where timing was kinder. Not in a dramatic, escapist way, but gently. Wondering what conversations would feel like without restraint. Wondering what it would be like to choose you openly, without consequence, without fear. Those thoughts weren't fantasies. They were acknowledgments. And acknowledgments change a person. This is where the letter becomes harder to read. Because they would tell you that after meeting you, they couldn't return to their old way of being. Something shifted permanently. They became more honest with themselves. Less comfortable with emotional shortcuts. Less willing to live on autopilot. You didn't become their escape. You became their mirror. And mirrors don't flatter, they reveal. They began questioning things they once accepted without thought. Asking themselves whether they were living truthfully or just conveniently. Whether the life they were in reflected who they really were, or just who they had learned to be. Those questions didn't come from dissatisfaction with someone else. They came from recognition of you. And that recognition didn't demand action, but it demanded integrity. So they wrote this letter silently, over and over again, in different forms. Sometimes it sounded like an apology. Sometimes like gratitude. Sometimes like a goodbye they never said. But underneath all versions was the same truth. You mattered to me in a way I wasn't ready for. They would want you to know that your presence wasn't a mistake. That the connection wasn't imagined. That what you felt was shared, even if it was never spoken aloud. They would want you to understand that choosing not to act wasn't the absence of feeling. It was the presence of responsibility. And that doesn't make the ache disappear. It just explains it. If they could finish this letter out loud, they would slow down again here. They would tell you that you didn't lose something meant for you. You encountered something meant to prepare you. That meeting them wasn't about possession or outcome, it was about awakening your own depth. Because now you know what recognition feels like. Now you know what mutual presence without chaos feels like. Now you know what love looks like when it's rooted in respect, not impulse. That knowledge will not leave you. And one day, when someone meets you without conditions, without restraint, without timing working against you, you will understand why this had to arrive exactly the way it did. This letter wasn't meant to pull you back. It was meant to release you. And this is only the beginning of what it holds. Stay with this quietly, because now the letter moves past introduction and into the part that was hardest for them to write. The part they rewrote 100 times in their mind but never trusted themselves to say out loud. This is where the honesty deepens, where excuses fall away, and where they stop trying to protect themselves from how real this actually was. They would tell you that there were nights when your name crossed their mind without warning. Not during moments of loneliness, but during moments of clarity. When the house was quiet. When the world wasn't asking anything from them. When they were alone with their own thoughts and couldn't hide behind roles, routines, or responsibilities. That's when you appeared, not as temptation, not as fantasy, but as a presence. Calm. Familiar. Unavoidable. And that scared them more than desire ever could, because desire can be dismissed, but presence changes how you see your life. They would admit that part of them hoped this connection would fade naturally, the way so many others had. That distance or time would dull it, that logic would quiet it, that silence would solve it. But instead of fading, it settled deeper. It became something they carried rather than something they fought. They learned to live around it, not because it disappeared, but because it had to. Because acknowledging it openly would have meant turning their entire world inside out, and they weren't ready for that kind of honesty yet. If this were truly a letter, this is where their words would grow slower, heavier, more deliberate. Because this is where they would finally say the thing they never let themselves say fully, that you saw them. Not the version of themselves they present to everyone else, not the role they play, not the expectations they meet, but the quieter, more vulnerable self they rarely let anyone touch. You noticed the pauses. You noticed the contradictions. You noticed the places where they smiled but weren't settled. And you didn't try to fix any of it. You didn't demand answers. You simply knew. And being known without being demanded is one of the most unsettling experiences a person can have. They would tell you that this is why restraint became their only option. Not because they lacked feeling, but because they felt too much to treat it lightly. They couldn't turn this into flirtation. They couldn't let it drift into emotional dependence. They couldn't allow you to become a secret they leaned on when life felt heavy. Doing that would have been easier, and it would have been wrong. So they chose the harder path, to feel quietly, to change privately, and to let the connection exist without consuming either of you. They would want you to know that this choice didn't make them feel strong. It made them feel exposed. Because once you meet someone who reflects you so clearly, you can't go back to pretending you're fully satisfied with half-truths. After you, they became more aware of the gaps in their own life. The conversations they avoided. The emotions they postponed. The compromises they told themselves were harmless. You didn't cause those gaps, you illuminated them. And illumination is uncomfortable, especially when action feels impossible. There were moments when they wondered if staying silent was unfair to you. If clarity would have been kinder than restraint. If explaining everything would have given you peace instead of questions. But each time they imagined speaking, they imagined the weight it would place on you, the burden of knowing something that couldn't move forward without cost. They didn't want to place you in that position. They didn't want you carrying responsibility for feelings you never asked for. So they swallowed the words instead, even when it hurt. This is where the letter becomes almost painful in its honesty. They would confess that choosing not to act didn't protect them from longing, it transformed it. It turned into a quiet ache that sharpened their awareness. They became more careful with others' emotions. Less casual with connection. More aware of how easily people can be pulled into situations they never consented to fully. Your presence didn't just affect how they felt about you, it changed how they moved through the world. They would tell you that they never once thought you were naive or unaware. They knew you felt it too. They saw it in the way you paused sometimes, in the way your energy shifted, in the way you gave space instead of pressure. And that mutual knowing, unspoken but undeniable, was both grounding and heartbreaking. Because it meant neither of you were imagining this. It was real. And real things don't disappear just because they're inconvenient. If they could be completely transparent, they would say that part of them wished you would forget them easily. Not because you didn't matter, but because they didn't want to be a lingering weight in your life. They didn't want to be the reason you questioned timing, fate, or yourself. They hoped, quietly, that someone would come into your life freely, openly, and love you in a way that required no restraint. And that hope came from care, not detachment. They would end this part of the letter by telling you something important, something they need you to hear clearly, that your worth was never tied to their inability to act. That the connection didn't stop because it lacked depth. It stopped where it did because depth requires freedom, and freedom wasn't available then. That distinction matters more than you know. This letter isn't asking you to wait. It isn't asking you to return. It isn't asking you to understand everything immediately. It's simply asking you not to doubt what you felt, and not to doubt yourself because of how it unfolded. What comes next in this letter goes even deeper, into what this connection was meant to awaken in you, not just in them. Stay with this gently, because now the letter moves into the part that was never about confession, apology, or explanation, it was about meaning. This is where they stopped trying to understand the connection in terms of circumstances and began understanding it in terms of transformation. And this part was written slowly, over time, in moments when they were alone enough to be honest with themselves. They would tell you that after everything settled into silence, after the restraint became routine, after the world continued as if nothing unusual had happened, something unexpected occurred. They didn't move on in the way people usually mean when they say that. They didn't forget. They didn't replace. They didn't bury what they felt. Instead, the connection changed how they lived. It altered the internal standard they held themselves to. They became less tolerant of emotional laziness in themselves. Less willing to hide behind, "This is just how life is." They noticed how often they used to silence their own truth for convenience, and how meeting you made that silence unbearable. You became a reference point, not as someone they longed for daily, but as a reminder of what honesty feels like when it arrives without force. They would admit that there were moments when they tried to minimize what this was. Moments when they told themselves it was simply timing, or projection, or a brief alignment that felt deeper than it really was. But every time they tried to shrink it, it expanded in a different way, not emotionally, but internally. It showed up as discomfort when they avoided conversations they should have had. It showed up as restlessness when they settled for surface-level interactions. It showed up as an inner voice that asked harder questions than before. And eventually, they understood that this connection wasn't meant to be resolved, it was meant to recalibrate them. If they were writing this honestly, they would tell you that you didn't enter their life to become part of it in the traditional sense. You entered it to interrupt it. To create a pause. To introduce contrast. Before you, they thought they understood depth. They thought they understood love, responsibility, commitment. But meeting you separated ideas from experience. It showed them that depth doesn't demand chaos, that connection doesn't need intensity to be real, that recognition can exist without possession. And once that truth landed, they couldn't return to who they were before. Even if nothing on the outside changed immediately, everything on the inside did. They would also tell you that part of the reason this connection lingered so quietly was because neither of you violated yourselves to keep it alive. You didn't chase them into confusion. You didn't demand answers that would have burdened both of you. You didn't turn the connection into something secret or consuming. And they didn't exploit your presence to soothe their own unrest. What existed between you was held, carefully, imperfectly, but with respect. And respect has memory. It doesn't fade the way impulsive passion does. It becomes part of how someone understands themselves. In this part of the letter, they would likely pause again, because this is where gratitude enters, not the polite kind, but the kind that comes from being changed. They would thank you, not for what you gave them emotionally, but for what you awakened. For reminding them that they are capable of feeling without escaping responsibility. For showing them that truth doesn't need to be loud to be transformative. For being a presence that asked nothing but authenticity. They might even acknowledge that this gratitude carries sadness with it, sadness for the version of life where this recognition could have arrived freely, without barriers, but that sadness no longer feels like loss. It feels like acceptance. They would want you to know that this experience refined them in ways they didn't expect. It made them more careful with people's hearts. More aware of how easily unspoken connections can entangle lives. More respectful of timing and consequence. You didn't teach them how to love recklessly. You taught them how to love responsibly. And that lesson stayed. If they were brave enough to say it plainly, they would tell you that this connection became a quiet line they never crossed, and that not crossing it became part of their integrity. Not because it was easy, but because it mattered. And living with that choice made them stronger, not weaker. It made them someone who understands that not every truth demands expression, and not every feeling demands pursuit. They would also say that they hope, sincerely, that you don't measure your worth by what this connection could not become. That you don't internalize restraint as rejection. That you don't carry this as a story where you were almost chosen. Because from their perspective, you were never almost anything. You were significant in a way that didn't require possession to be real. And significance doesn't disappear just because it doesn't become permanent. This part of the letter exists to do one thing above all else, to release you from doubt. Doubt about whether you imagined it. Doubt about whether it mattered. Doubt about whether you were asking for too much simply by being who you are. They would want you to know that you weren't wrong to feel what you felt. You weren't dramatic. You weren't projecting. You weren't naive. You were responding to something real that arrived without warning and left without resolution, but not without impact. And if they could close this section gently, they would tell you this, that some connections are not meant to become stories you live inside forever. Some are meant to become truths you carry forward. This was one of those. Not a destination, but a turning point. Not a relationship, but a revelation. The letter continues. But now it turns fully toward you, and what this connection was meant to unlock in your life next. Stay with this all the way through, because this part of the letter is where everything quietly turns toward you. Not toward what happened, not toward what couldn't be, but toward what was awakened inside you that will now shape the rest of your life. This is the part they wrote with the most care, because it carries responsibility. Not to pull you back, not to reopen anything, but to make sure you don't walk forward doubting yourself. They would tell you that even from a distance, even in silence, they could sense the way this connection changed you too. They noticed it in how you grew quieter but stronger. In how you stopped over-explaining yourself. In how you learn to feel deeply without collapsing into emotion. You didn't harden, you clarified. And that clarity is not something everyone achieves. It usually comes only after loving with restraint, after choosing dignity when desire would have been easier. They would tell you that what you felt wasn't an accident of chemistry or imagination. It was resonance. The kind that doesn't depend on availability or outcome. The kind that meets you at the level of the soul and says, "This is what depth feels like." And once you feel that, you are never meant to go back to shallow substitutes. That wasn't cruelty. That was preparation. In this part of the letter, they would acknowledge something gently but firmly, that the pain you carried wasn't just about them. It was about the collapse of an illusion, the illusion that timing doesn't matter, that love alone is enough, that wanting something deeply guarantees its place in your life. Losing that illusion hurts. But living without it makes you wise. They would tell you that after this experience, your intuition became sharper. You started trusting what your body told you before your mind caught up. You felt when something was off without needing proof. You sensed when someone was emotionally present or emotionally absent, even if their words sounded right. That ability didn't come from overthinking, it came from being honest with yourself in a situation where denial would have been easier. They would want you to know that this is not something to unlearn. Because this connection didn't arrive to confuse you. It arrived to calibrate you. To set your inner compass to a truer north. Before this, you might have been willing to tolerate emotional ambiguity longer than you should have. You might have explained away distance, inconsistency, or half-presence because you believed patience was love. Now you know the difference between patience and self-abandonment. And that knowledge will protect you. They would write, slowly and deliberately, that you are not meant to be someone's hidden chapter, their quiet, what if, or their almost. You are meant to be met openly, chosen clearly, and loved without restraint. And if this connection showed you anything, it's how deeply you require, and deserve, that kind of love. This part of the letter would also carry reassurance, because they know how easy it is for someone like you to turn depth inward and blame yourself. To wonder if you should have walked away sooner. If you should have felt less. If you should have protected yourself better. They would tell you that you did protect yourself, by staying aligned with your values. By not crossing lines you couldn't live with later. By choosing respect even when no one was watching. That is not weakness. That is strength most people never develop. They would tell you that one day, someone will meet you without barriers, without complications, without timing working against you. And when that happens, you will recognize the difference instantly, not because it feels more intense, but because it feels easy without being shallow. It will feel like effort flowing both ways. Like presence that doesn't require guessing. Like honesty that doesn't cost you peace. And when that love arrives, this chapter will finally make complete sense. Not because it led to that person directly, but because it prepared you to receive them fully. They would want you to stop thinking of this as something that went unfinished. Some things are complete not because they concluded, but because they accomplished their purpose. This connection accomplished its purpose the moment it awakened your self-respect, your discernment, and your refusal to settle for love that lives in the shadows. They would write that you don't need to carry this story as a wound anymore. You can carry it as wisdom. As proof of your depth. As evidence that you are capable of feeling profoundly without losing yourself. That combination is rare. And it will shape every meaningful connection you have from here on. If they could end this part of the letter with one truth they hope you hold on to, it would be this: you were never meant to stay where you had to wait quietly to be chosen. You were meant to walk forward into a life where love meets you in the open. And nothing about this experience disqualifies you from that future, it qualifies you for it. The letter doesn't end here. But from this point on, it no longer looks backward. It looks forward, toward the life you are now ready to live, with clarity instead of questions, and with trust in yourself instead of doubt. Stay with this gently, because this part of the letter is where everything finally settles into something steady, something you can carry without strain. This is the part they wrote not from longing, not from regret, but from a place of quiet certainty, the place you only reach after you've stopped fighting what was and started understanding what it gave you. They would tell you that over time, they realized something important. The connection didn't linger because it was unresolved, but because it was complete. Complete in a way that didn't need continuation to remain meaningful. Complete in the way a truth is complete once it's known. At first, that idea felt impossible to accept. How could something end without ever fully beginning? How could something feel finished without closure? But slowly, they understood that not all endings arrive with explanations. Some arrive as inner alignment. The moment when your heart and your values stop arguing with each other. They would tell you that they no longer carry this connection as a weight. It became something quieter, something integrated into who they are now. It no longer pulls at them or asks anything from them. It simply exists as part of their internal landscape, like a turning point they can trace growth back to. And they would want you to know this, because they don't want you to believe that what you shared turned into regret on their side. It didn't. It turned into awareness. They would explain that this awareness changed how they understand love itself. Before you, love felt like something that happened to them, something driven by circumstance, attraction, timing. After you, love became something they understood as a responsibility to themselves and others. They learned that feeling deeply is not enough if it costs integrity. That chemistry is not destiny if it demands self-betrayal. That some connections arrive not to be lived out, but to teach you what kind of life you want to live from now on. They would want you to know that this lesson wasn't abstract. It showed up in their daily choices. In how they speak more honestly now. In how they avoid emotional shortcuts. In how they no longer entertain connections that rely on ambiguity or convenience. You didn't just touch their heart, you sharpened their conscience. And that influence didn't disappear when the silence settled. It stayed. In this part of the letter, they would also address something they know you may still carry quietly, the fear that this connection somehow stalled your life, delayed your happiness, or held you back. They would say, gently but firmly, that this is not true. They would tell you that nothing about this experience put you behind. In fact, it moved you forward faster than you realize. It forced you to grow emotional clarity that many people only develop after years of confusion and compromise. They would tell you that you learned how to sit with desire without letting it control you. How to feel longing without acting against your values. How to walk away internally even when your heart hadn't fully caught up yet. Those are not small lessons. Those are foundations. And they will support you in ways you haven't yet seen. They would also acknowledge that you may still feel a quiet sadness sometimes, not because you want the past back, but because you recognize how rare it is to meet someone who sees you clearly. They would want you to know that this sadness doesn't mean you're stuck. It means you're capable of depth. And depth always comes with sensitivity. But sensitivity, when paired with self-respect, becomes discernment. Not suffering. They would tell you that from where they stand now, they don't see this connection as something that almost was. They see it as something that was exactly what it needed to be. A moment of truth. A moment of recognition. A moment that clarified the cost of settling and the value of honesty. They would say that if circumstances had been different, the lesson might not have been learned at all. Comfort often delays growth. This connection did not. They would want you to release the idea that this story needs a dramatic ending to be meaningful. That love needs to culminate in possession to be real. That a soulmate must always stay. Some soulmates come to walk with you. Others come to turn you. To redirect you toward your own integrity. To wake up parts of you that were sleeping. This was one of those. They would write that you don't need to guard your heart harder because of this. You don't need to become cynical or closed. What you need, and already have, is discernment. The ability to recognize when a connection is aligned with your life and when it's only aligned with your longing. That skill will save you years. They would also tell you that you don't owe this story to anyone else. You don't have to explain it. You don't have to justify it. You don't have to make it sound smaller or bigger than it was. It belongs to you. And what belongs to you can be honored privately. As they close this part of the letter, they would remind you of something you may forget on harder days: you did nothing wrong by feeling deeply. You did nothing wrong by staying true to your values. You did nothing wrong by letting something meaningful pass through your life without forcing it to stay. That combination, depth and restraint, is not common. And because it lives in you now, your future will not look like your past. The next connection that enters your life will not confuse you in the same way. It will not require silence to survive. It will not ask you to hold back pieces of yourself to keep it intact. It will meet you where you stand, openly, freely, and without complication. This letter was never meant to pull you backward into memory. It was meant to steady you as you move forward. And that is exactly what it has done. Stay with this to the very end, because this final part of the letter is the one they hoped you would feel more than read. This is not written from longing anymore, not from confusion, not even from quiet regret. This is written from the place you reach only after something has fully passed through you and left you changed in a way that no longer hurts. This is written from acceptance that is calm, steady, and honest. They would tell you that time did what silence could not. It didn't erase what existed, but it softened its edges until it fit into life without cutting. Slowly, without effort, the connection stopped asking for attention. It stopped resurfacing as a question. It stopped needing interpretation. It became part of their internal history, like a moment they could point to and say, "This is where I learned something important about myself." They would tell you that there came a day when they realized they no longer felt tension when thinking of you. No pull. No ache. Just a quiet respect and an understanding that something meaningful had been held with care instead of being consumed. That realization didn't come with relief the way endings sometimes do. It came with calm. The kind of calm that settles into your body and stays. They would want you to know that this calm didn't mean forgetting. It meant integration. It meant that the connection no longer lived outside of them as something unfinished. It lived inside them as wisdom. And wisdom doesn't shout. It doesn't demand. It simply informs how you move forward. They would tell you that the biggest shift happened when they stopped defining this connection by what it could not become. When they stopped seeing it as blocked, interrupted, or incomplete. Instead, they began seeing it as precise. Exactly as long as it needed to be. Exactly as deep as it needed to go. No more. No less. They would want you to understand that this is how some soul connections work. They don't arrive to stay forever. They arrive to adjust the direction of your life slightly, but permanently. A small shift that changes everything downstream. This was that kind of connection. They would tell you that after this, they could no longer live casually with their own dishonesty. Not with themselves. Not with others. Once you feel what genuine recognition is like, you can't pretend that surface-level living satisfies you. That awareness doesn't go away. It becomes part of your spine. It straightens you. They would also tell you that they see now how much strength it took for you to carry this with grace. How easy it would have been to collapse into self-doubt, resentment, or longing. How easy it would have been to tell yourself a story where you were lacking or unlucky. And yet, you didn't. You questioned, yes. You felt pain, yes. But you didn't turn against yourself. That matters. They would tell you that the way you handled this connection says more about your readiness for real love than any relationship ever could. You didn't demand what couldn't be given. You didn't shrink yourself to stay connected. You didn't betray your values to keep a feeling alive. Those choices shape destiny more than chemistry ever does. They would want you to stop carrying any quiet shame about this experience. There is nothing shameful about recognizing another soul. There is nothing wrong with feeling deeply. There is nothing weak about restraint. If anything, this experience proved that you are capable of holding complexity without losing your integrity. They would also want you to know that you are not meant to measure future love against this one in a painful way. This was not the peak of what you will feel. It was the calibration point. It showed you what resonance feels like so that you never again mistake attachment for alignment. They would tell you that one day, when love meets you without barriers, you will notice something immediately. You won't feel the need to interpret signals. You won't feel tension between desire and values. You won't feel like you have to hold back parts of yourself to keep the connection safe. It will feel open. Mutual. Grounded. And you will be ready for it in a way you could not have been before this experience. They would tell you that this is why the letter ends here, not with longing, not with apology, not with an invitation. Because this was never about pulling you back into memory. It was about making sure you walk forward without doubt. They would want you to trust that nothing meaningful was wasted. That no depth you accessed will go unused. That every layer of awareness you gained will serve you. That love did not pass you by. It refined you. They would want you to release the need for a final conversation, a final explanation, a final emotional exchange. Closure did not come through words because it came through growth. You outgrew the question. And finally, they would want you to know this, clearly and without hesitation: you were never meant to stay in a story that required restraint forever. You were meant to move toward a life where love meets you in the open, where timing cooperates, where integrity does not feel like sacrifice. This letter exists so you don't mistake silence for insignificance. So you don't confuse restraint with rejection. So you don't carry doubt into the future where clarity belongs. If you've read this far, it's because something in you already understands. You are not behind. You are not waiting anymore. You are not unfinished. You are standing at the beginning of a chapter that will not require you to hide, hold back, or translate your depth into loneliness. And this letter, now complete, was never meant to stay with you forever. It was meant to walk you to this exact moment, and then let you go. Stay a little longer, because this part of the letter was never meant to arrive with urgency. It was meant to arrive when you were finally steady enough to receive it without pain. This is the part they wrote when they realized that whatever needed to be said was no longer about healing a wound, but about honoring a truth that would travel with you into the rest of your life. They would tell you that there is a moment, subtle and almost unnoticeable, when something that once mattered deeply stops asking for space inside you. Not because it was wrong. Not because it lost its value. But because it completed its work. That moment doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, like a breath you didn't realize you were holding finally releasing on its own. That is where you are now. You may still remember everything clearly, but the memory no longer tightens your chest. You may still understand the depth of what passed between you, but it no longer destabilizes you. It exists as something acknowledged, respected, and finished. And that finish does not feel like loss. It feels like arrival. They would tell you that this is what real closure looks like. Not a final conversation. Not an explanation. Not an apology or a confession. Real closure is when your inner world no longer reorganizes itself around something that cannot move forward. It's when your emotional energy comes home to you. They would tell you that they reached this place too, but in a different way. For them, it arrived as accountability. As a clear understanding that some connections do not ask to be pursued, but to be honored through restraint. That lesson changed how they see themselves. It stripped away excuses. It made them more deliberate, more careful, more aligned with the kind of person they want to be. And even though your paths did not continue together, that shared shift remains real. They would want you to know that this connection was never meant to live in regret. Regret implies something was mishandled. This was not mishandled. It was held with care under difficult circumstances. That matters. That counts. That integrity does not disappear just because the story didn't unfold outwardly. They would also tell you that it's okay if you sometimes feel a quiet tenderness when you think back. Tenderness is not attachment. It is respect for something that was meaningful without being destructive. You don't have to harden yourself to move on. You don't have to erase the past to live fully in the present. You are allowed to remember without returning. You are allowed to honor without reopening. You are allowed to carry depth forward without carrying pain. They would tell you that this experience refined your emotional language. You now know the difference between intensity and truth, between longing and alignment, between chemistry and compatibility. Those distinctions are not theoretical for you anymore. They are lived knowledge. And lived knowledge changes how you choose. You will notice it in the future, often before you can explain it. You will feel when something is not right without needing proof. You will sense when someone is unavailable even if their words sound convincing. You will recognize when a connection is asking you to wait in ways that cost you your peace. And because of what you've lived, you will not negotiate with that feeling. That is not fear. That is wisdom. They would want you to trust that this wisdom will not make you lonely. It will make you selective. And selectivity is what allows real love to find you. Not the kind that arrives with complications already attached. But the kind that meets you openly, clearly, and without needing you to shrink or pause your life. They would also want you to know that this chapter did not delay your destiny. It aligned it. It removed paths that would have cost you more later. It saved you from futures where you might have settled for half-presence because you didn't yet know what full recognition feels like. Now you know. And knowing changes what you accept. They would tell you that the reason this letter kept unfolding in parts was because growth does not happen all at once. You don't wake up healed. You don't suddenly understand everything. You move through layers. Confusion. Clarity. Sadness. Acceptance. Strength. And finally, trust. Trust in yourself. Trust that you can feel deeply without losing your direction. Trust that you can walk away without bitterness. Trust that what is meant for you will not require restraint forever. They would tell you that you are no longer in the phase of questioning your worth or your intuition. You are in the phase of living from it. And living from it will attract different experiences, different people, different outcomes. Not louder ones. Truer ones. You may notice that you are more patient now, but less tolerant. You don't rush connection, but you don't linger in ambiguity either. You give space, but not at the expense of your own clarity. Those balances did not come from theory. They came from living through something that asked you to choose yourself quietly, over and over again. That is the kind of strength that lasts. They would tell you that if love arrives again, it will not ask you to be smaller. It will not arrive already constrained. It will not require you to translate your depth into silence. It will recognize you and move toward you without hesitation. And when that happens, you will understand fully why this chapter had to end exactly the way it did. Not as a tragedy. Not as a mistake. But as preparation. This part of the letter exists to affirm what you already feel deep down, that you are no longer defined by what didn't happen. You are defined by how you became more yourself through it. You didn't lose time. You gained alignment. You didn't miss out. You refined your path. You didn't love in vain. You loved with integrity. And integrity always returns to you in the form of peace. So let this be the part where you stop revisiting the story to see if it still hurts. Let this be the part where you recognize that it doesn't, not in the way it once did. Let this be the part where you allow yourself to fully step forward, unburdened. This letter has done what it came to do. It reminded you of your depth. It confirmed your intuition. It released you from doubt. And now, it gently steps out of the way. What comes next doesn't need explanation. You will recognize it when it arrives. Because you are ready now. And that readiness is the quiet, unshakable ending of this story.